Hi, good evening, everyone. I do hope it's true. I want to do a shout out and a thank you to our board of directors, advisory group, anyone who donated to tonight's event, and of course, our members for their continued support. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan organization, and our main mission is focused on international understanding and cultural awareness. So we have three focus areas, as you can see a little bit behind me. We focus on global education for all ages, professional exchanges through the US Department of State, and of course, cultural awareness for our community. So welcome to tonight's event, Afghanistan. Where do we go from here? With Linda Robinson, the director of RAND Center for Middle East Public Policy, and an internationally known expert on the post 9/11 long wars. It was a little over a year ago that we actually invited Linda to come talk to our group about ending America's forever wars. If some of you were there, you might recall during the election, we were talking about how both US presidential candidates pledged to end America's forever wars and bring US combat troops home. And here we are today talking about Afghanistan and what that pullout looks like. Before we get into tonight's topic, I want to note that we will be taking questions throughout the discussion. So we encourage you to submit your questions as soon as you have them. If you have them now, even you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for Linda. I will briefly go ahead and introduce Linda, and then we'll kick into some questions of our own. Linda is the director, as I mentioned, of the Center for Middle East Public Policy and is senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. Linda has authored prize-winning and best-selling books on U.S. Special Forces, Iraq, and Afghanistan based on extended travel in the region's war zones, and led research teams at RAND in 20 studies to assess U.S. and coalition policy, strategy, military operations and stabilization, and conflict resolution endeavors. Linda has 30 years of experience in international affairs and national security. Her research and journalism has taken her around the world, including an extensive sojourns in the Middle East and South Asia, and she has testified before Congress on Iraq, Special Operations Forces, and counterterrorism. She has been traveling to Afghanistan. She began traveling to Afghanistan in 2002 as a journalist, and spent a great deal of time there during 2009 through 2012. She is also a noted author and has written on America's war in Afghanistan in her 2013 book, 100 Victories, Special Ops and the Future of American Warfare, and thereafter did work on Afghanistan as a RAND researcher. So again, welcome, Linda. And we're so glad to have you here tonight. And we'll just go ahead and get right into our first question, as I'm sure there are lots more to come. So first question to you tonight. Reports are surfacing that Biden received several concerns regarding a rapid withdrawal from our intel community, our allies, our boots on the ground. And so first, my question is, was this outcome that we're seeing today inevitable when the US pulled out of Afghanistan? And second, if so, would more time, say 6 months, 1 year, 10 years, have led to a different outcome?
Thank you so much, Michelle, and I'm really delighted to be with you and your members and attendees again. It's terrific to see you all. I think that the exit from Afghanistan was likely to be traumatic. However, I think it's been quite a bit more chaotic than it might have been. I think it's important to just note quickly, as we discussed last year, the Biden campaign had pledged to end the so-called forever wars as senator and then as vice president. It was always Joe Biden's position that he wanted a counterterrorism only approach in Afghanistan and was skeptical of more ambitious efforts. But when he became president, of course, there was an immediate decision about whether to stick to the deadline that had been established in the accord signed in February 2020 by the Trump administration that called for a total withdrawal by May 1. So he delayed that somewhat, but he did endorse the withdrawal. And part of the rationale was that to abrogate that accord would likely mean the Taliban would resume attacks against US forces in Afghanistan. And since his position basically had been it was time to get out, I think that he would have set the date and moved ahead in this first year regardless. And I think there are a number of reasons why this withdrawal has been so um, devastating in terms of the collapse of the government and the forces. So we can talk more about that. But you specifically ask about the intel community and others who had argued for a less rapid withdrawal. And that is true. The Defense Department wanted a longer timeline. The NATO allies who actually had 3/4 of the forces left on the ground because the Trump administration had progressively reduced forces. And I think that there was a sense that a slower withdrawal would have minimized risks. That is, I think you can argue this both ways, and this is what we're approaching with 5 days left of the withdrawal timeline since President Biden has reaffirmed his intention to withdraw by next week. And I think when you reach that ultimate day, there are going to be lots of people struggling to get out and lots of chaos, frankly, up until the last minute.
Since you brought up that deadline, President Biden is sticking to August 31st. That's less than a week away from today. And the Taliban, I've seen in various news outlets, isn't extending the US stay past the end of the month. I've seen a few things saying that they would see it as a clear violation of last year's peace agreement. So I guess I'm just curious, what should we be expecting, when in September hits? What's this mean for the people of Afghanistan? Do a majority of them want the US out and are okay moving forward with the potential Taliban rule?
Well, I think there's great fear on the part of the population as to what comes next, and fear about how the Taliban will govern. And that's really, I think, the critical question at this point. And then also what the US and other countries may hopefully collectively do to try to make the best of the situation and use the available leverage. But again, I think it's very important for people who maybe haven't followed this day to day. The real tipping point was that February 2020 agreement in which the US troop presence was delinked from achievement of a negotiated settlement or even a ceasefire. All the Taliban had to do was be sitting at the talks at the table. Nothing really agreed. And they made a pledge not to formally break with Al Qaeda, but at least to prevent the use of its territory under its control by foreign terrorist groups, and specifically, of course, Al Qaeda, given the 9/11 attacks, is what the US is particularly concerned about. So I think that now, if we're going to sort of talk about the future, and I do hope there'll be some questions about what we tried that worked and didn't work, and why this 20-year saga has ended precisely the way it has. What is likely, I think, going forward is the Taliban is very much in control of the country. There's a small group of Tajik-based resistance up in Panjshir in the north of the country. They're not getting much international support at this point. There's kind of a sense that the Taliban is consolidating. They've had shadow governors in many provinces for years. So this is really sort of the culmination of them coming into power sort of very I have to say the departure of Ashraf Ghani from the president of Afghanistan, kind of in the dead of night, sneaking away, was such an ignominious departure that if you put yourself in the place of the soldiers on the front line, and provincial leaders were cutting deals, it would be, I think, unfair to say the frontline Afghan soldier should have stayed at his post while all around him, people higher up the chain of command were deserting. And I think that that's really a sad, sad moment. I think that what we have really looking forward is to ask the question, what is in the Taliban's interest to go back to the way they governed before: extreme brutality, repression, denial of rights to women, executions in the stadiums, just horrific rule. They will get no recognition, sanctions won't be lifted, they'll get very little assistance. And I think even some of the countries that recognized them before may withhold. So I think to the degree that leverage works, maybe that will moderate. Maybe they also understand and have matured. I mean, they're not unsophisticated, and I think we need to really understand the Taliban has been a very organized force for quite a long time. And so I kind of have a wait and see attitude to just see how they may choose to govern. They have a big social media campaign going on right now. They're saying some of the right things about women continuing with education and jobs, but it would be foolish to simply accept their words, and it's important to see what they do.
Do you see the Taliban allowing safe haven for Al Qaeda again, like they did prior to 2001?
So, and this is obviously a primary concern for the US government, and given that the Biden administration has pledged to, that was really the main concern it espoused with regard to Afghanistan, that it not become a safe haven again. The good news, if there's good news in this, is that Al Qaeda has been much decimated, and at the maximum, they're estimated to be maybe 500 affiliated fighters of Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. Other reports, and this UN reporting is publicly available, a few dozen, it may be as small as a few dozen. So that is good. It does, however, depend on how the Taliban approaches its rule. It's not necessarily in its interest to allow Al Qaeda to take root if they're trying to establish themselves and gain assistance and gain some type of recognition. The other element there, of course, is the Islamic State, and they are. It's a different kind of group. Part of them they really grew out of elements of the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, and that formed ISIS-K, as it's called. I think they and Taliban have been actively fighting them. So again, I think the Taliban doesn't necessarily have an interest in letting those groups flourish and take root. And, lest I seem too sanguine about these risks, there is certainly going to be a concerted effort on the part of the US to develop a counterterrorism over the horizon capability. That's very hard to implement without valid intelligence on the ground, and that could be very hard to come by. But the other aspect of this is that the neighboring countries have a great interest in Afghanistan not becoming a safe haven again for these kinds of outward-looking foreign terrorist groups, and that would include, of course, Iran, Russia, China, Pakistan. And Pakistan has played kind of a complicated game over the years, but they certainly don't want a force taking root in Afghanistan that will come over and attack them.
So just as a reminder to our audience, again, we are going to be taking questions throughout this hour. There are quite a few that have come in, so I am going to kind of switch over to some of those for a few minutes. So if you do have questions for Linda, please drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So the administration, you mentioned over the horizon, it's a question about that. The administration keeps talking about over the horizon ways to tamp down on terrorism. How realistic do you think it is to rely on over the horizon in Afghanistan? We won't have on the ground intel or air controllers. The distances to any US assets is great, and Pakistan likely won't be helpful. So, is this really realistic going forward?
A great question, and the questioner obviously has a great deal of understanding of the issue and the difficulties. And I do agree it's going to be very difficult to carry out. We do have, and I know that the posture right now of Afghanistan is not to allow the US to be based there and do some of the things it previously had done. Will that change if the situation degrades? Other neighboring countries perhaps will have an interest. Russia has made known its interest. Of course, that would be kind of complicated given the state of our relations with Russia. That might not be the ideal one. Offshore basing in terms of on an aircraft carrier or farther away, you get into logistical difficulties. And I think that while we can conduct some types of military operations, precision counterterrorism, I keep coming back to the issue of intelligence. You simply cannot carry out those types of operations without intelligence. And even if there are some Afghans on the ground that we're still working with, it's very hard for intelligence personnel to run sources and vet that intelligence. And over the years, intelligence coming out of the country has definitely needed to be validated.
And on that note about intelligence, there's an interesting question about that. So, do you feel the intelligence community gave bad intel to the administration and the DoD? What worked and what didn't work?
Um, there's going to, I'm sure, be quite a bit more examination of the exact range of reporting. I know this has become kind of a political football, and the various estimates did adapt, did change and shift, and indeed the prospects of a collapse. The timeline was shortened as it became apparent that certain things weren't happening, because initially there was a plan to ensure that the contractor support, the logistic support to keep, especially the Afghan Air Force flying, that contract for contractor support would not be shifted over to the Afghan government. And once those individuals left and took their systems with them, that was a major inflection point. And it goes back to one of my principal critiques of how we did this over these many years, was to build such a centralized security force in image, really mirror imaging, the US model, and dependent heavily on air operations rather than ground forces, and compounding that by using Black Hawks instead of the simpler Russian airframes that they'd been used to. And so there were many, many layers to this, but without the air cover, the Afghan army that we built simply would not be able to operate. And we can talk about, was there an alternative, because there was. And we didn't get them to independent operations, which is really where we should have been as of the surge of 2011 and about the time I was writing my book. So once you take away those support pieces, that begins to hurt their ability to function. And then some of the deal cutting and the lack of, Ashraf Ghani refused to sit down and negotiate seriously with the Taliban. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, made a pitch and an effort to do that, to try to say you need to at least reach some kind of interim agreement that probably would have had Ghani stepping aside and have some kind of interim government. He refused to do that. And there are many, many reasons why, as the months and the weeks wore on, this became increasingly precarious. And the macro picture is that the so-called strategic stalemate on the ground was actually eroding over the past several years. So for those of us that watched this closely, it was unfortunately a tragedy we were seeing come to fruition.
Can the Taliban effectively govern and keep the economy Afghanistan going? It looks like the economy will fail, and quickly.
Yes, and Afghanistan has been heavily dependent on U.S. and international aid, and it's largely a subsistence economy. There's also very healthy opium, poppy, illegal business, and this is, I think this is the human suffering part of this is significant. Setting aside what the Taliban may impose in terms of draconian rule and punishments, its ability to help people sustain their livelihoods in the near term, but move ahead. And there were certainly many gains made over the years in terms of children in school, especially girls in school, but overall education levels and other indices, including infant and maternal mortality. So I think that we are unfortunately going to see a lot of suffering inside Afghanistan, and then we'll, I'm sure, have some more discussion about the refugee situation, and that can be expected to worsen.
You brought up some women's rights and obviously the mortality rate there. I'm just curious if you can go into that a little more in depth about how you see that kind of, I don't want to call it a crisis at this point, but that kind of humanitarian effort declining within the country.
Yes, well, I make two, I think, key points, and this is a very, very critical issue, because Afghanistan has always been at the lower end among the countries suffering the worst infant, and I think at a certain point it had the worst infant mortality and maternal mortality. It has improved over the years, but unfortunately it did retrograde a bit, partly because of the pandemic, and now I think is going to be exacerbated by something of a brain drain, as some of the educated class and some of the women, doctors, nurses, midwives, will leave. And so I think that we're unfortunately looking at some difficult times ahead. There's also just a food shortage, and there's a drought. So there are many underlying conditions that are going to worsen rapidly. And one thing is, what is going to be the posture as far as relieving human suffering through humanitarian aid? And will the international community still be generous and willing to support the aid that flows through the UN, the International Red Cross, the various international agencies? It's not about giving money directly to the Taliban. And I think we have to hopefully be poised, the world community, to support people. The other thing that will be pending is, will that leverage that I mentioned at the outset, the idea that if the Taliban comport themselves as a decent regime and respect the rights of its people, will some aid sanctions be lifted and some types of aid be renewed? I did see today, and unfortunately I have not had the time to confirm it, but the former president, Hamid Karzai, and a couple of other individuals are reported to be part of joining the government in some fashion. Now, if that is true, they may be extracting some concessions that will defend and help support people's rights and livelihoods. And so I think we'd be looking both at internal deals as well as the international community banding together, not just the G7 developed countries, but hopefully there's an emergency session of the G20 called, and hopefully they will come out with a common platform. And I think that kind of joint position by the international community is absolutely critical right now to pressure and cajole the Taliban into becoming that more humane government, which it must be.
To follow up a little bit, how do you see the Taliban in the context of this power vacuum that you mentioned left when NATO forces and the Afghan government leave interacting with that international community?
I'm sorry, Michelle, the power vacuum left by our and the
I'm trying to like
international
rephrase
forces.
this. Yeah, I'm trying to see how this was supposed to be phrased. So I'm thinking because all of the aid, like you mentioned, is leaving, and a lot of it also has to do with the economy, right? Because there's so much cash that was brought in from the international community to support the government in Afghanistan. When those things are not available anymore, what is going to happen, and how is, I guess, the Taliban going to start interacting with the international community? You know, does the Taliban need its neighbors to support them?
Right. So it's a good question, because it's really, I would just say maybe what I'm hearing, or one way to frame this is, does the Taliban even care about the Afghan people, right? Are they compelled in any way by any of this leverage and promise of aid to do anything? It's already a subsistence economy. It can go into a full autarkic type of economy. They could just turn a blind eye to mass suffering around them. Of course, there'll be even greater refugee outflows. I want to just note, because there's been a lot of criticism over the years of Pakistan, but it's important to note they have borne the largest burden of the refugees, now 5 million, and from Afghanistan, and 1.5 million of those just this year. So that is the kind of thing I think you're just going to start seeing a widening and deepening of that crisis for the countries surrounding Afghanistan. Not to say there won't be suffering inside Afghanistan, but I think if the Taliban won't budge and decide to rule in a draconian way, I think there will just be increasing outflows. And that is certainly in the long term, not in the long-term interest of Afghanistan to be deprived of the people and the talent there. So I think that's one quite likely scenario.
Thank you. So this should be hopefully a direct question. Can you contrast this withdrawal from Afghanistan to the US withdrawal of Vietnam? Were there airlifts or major efforts to protect those Vietnamese who helped us in that war?
Yes. Well, I want to caveat that I am not an expert in Vietnam. I certainly had come of age and was following it as a very young person, and knew it was a traumatic and major event in our country's life. The numbers, as I understand it, Gerald Ford did move quickly, and there was I think 120, 130,000 Vietnamese evacuated. And of course, there was also a massive refugee outflow, and then eventually led to some very actually generous immigration laws that, as Senator Biden had endorsed. And I'm hopeful that there will be generosity with regard to refugees. I know that Europe, as well as the US, have had a major reaction, anti-immigration consequences politically, very anti-immigrant parties and sentiment that largely came out of the Syrian refugee crisis. And Afghanistan just has been one of the countries that has unfortunately been so turbulent. It's created, I think, the second or third largest refugee population in the world. What I would like to say about the reaction of this administration, which I know is coming in for a lot of criticism, they have ramped up I think they did not move early enough to initiate and get people out of the country when it was determined they were going to go for the earlier and quicker withdrawal. But their numbers as of today are now up to 82,300 that they have been able to evacuate. And there are 5 additional days of operations. They probably won't continue at the pace of 19 or 20,000 a day, but my guess is they'll probably roughly approach what the Gerald Ford numbers were that I mentioned. But I think it's more important to say now what's next, because there are lots of categories of people that don't fit the ones that they've defined as already having passports, green cards, special immigrant visas, people already designated as folks that are going to come out. There's a large category called P2, P2 refugees that many Afghans might qualify for, but the arrangement that had been announced was those people had to apply outside of Afghanistan and outside of the US. And at this point, getting to other countries, very limited ability to do so. And of course, they have to have the means to support themselves while they make that application, which can take quite a long time, years.
So just thinking about this criticism, what were some of the other options or tactics that could have been taken to make a different outcome when the US pulled out of Afghanistan?
Well, the very first thing regarding the tactical decision of when to withdraw and the timeline, I understand the argument that the Taliban could have reneged on its commitment and begun attacking US forces that would then force the administration to decide, are we going to surge more troops in? Something that President Biden was dead set against. But we don't know for sure that that would have happened. They might have set a later date. There are some people that have been arguing that we could have continued to keep 4,000 or 5,000 troops on the ground there, and that would have been the finger in the dike. And my assessment, and I think a year ago I might have, and even on your at this gathering, I might have suggested that was viable. But the problem is once that dynamic starts happening and the sucking sound starts growing, it's very hard for a small number of troops to do much of anything. And the situation was deteriorating. And then, of course, it just became astonishingly rapid. While I expected a number of areas of the country to fall. And as I mentioned before, the Taliban has had a latent presence or control in much of the country for many years. They made a very astute decision to go north and take some of the northern provinces because that's where some of the non-Pashtun militias were that might have posed a resistance. And then once that was done and there wasn't an effective defense being mounted, they realized they could move on Kabul, which was something I would not have expected. So I think that we just have to really understand the entire tapestry here and what was and wasn't possible. I would like, since I've been immersed in this for so many years, I think it was really important that we did not adopt the right model of the type of security force that Afghanistan could have sustained. It's really important for the US to learn this lesson and not impose a model that's not appropriate, such that they could never get to independent operations. We also prioritized a war fighting and an attrition strategy, thinking all we had to do was keep the pressure militarily on the Taliban, rather than focusing on really getting to that independently capable security force, number one, but also much as important or more important, finding the political solution to this conflict, which at the end of the day was and is a civil war. Yes, with elements of terrorist groups, yes, with elements of extremist behavior, but it's built on this tapestry of factions and divisions that the Afghans themselves are going to have to resolve.
So going back to something you mentioned previously about how, some of the Afghanistan people, they are defined categories already. So they are able to leave potentially by August 31st, but there are others who are not categorized and probably can't really get their refugee status. So what does this mean for those Afghanis who are still trying to leave the country? And is there anything that American citizens can do for these refugees?
Yes. Well, I think it's very important for Americans who care about this to be communicating with their representatives in Congress. I think it's very important that a policy develop. What you have right now, and it is laudable in that many Americans, they just feel we do not just a humanitarian impulse, but the people that helped us wage this effort, we owe our support to. We those that were working directly with not just U.S. forces, but all kinds of civilian agencies, U.S. Agency for International Development. Many of these people also invested in the future of a country that was a much more open and modern society. And so there's also that kind of moral dilemma that they trusted this could be their future, and they are now potentially at risk. Some key leaders, women leaders, have been assassinated. Others, the Hazara population, suffered greatly under the previous Taliban. It's a Shia minority population. There are all kinds of potential risks for people, and I think we need to formulate a policy that will respond to what the Taliban does in a way that will help people. That said, Afghanistan does need its talent and it needs its diversity for the long term. And what many people may not know was in the 70s and 80s, this country did have a more modern society. Women were out and about, people had educations. It kind of went into the dark ages of civil war and the rise of the Taliban. And it just, I think we have to realize that Afghanistan's crisis now doesn't have to be a permanent crisis. I would say, though, we have to be very wary about any ideas that the US can wave a wand and make it so. We spend $1 trillion, 2,300 combat lives were lost, and we, I think, had too many ideas that of pouring money in and expecting quick results, and societies generally change at a slower pace.
So I'm going to kind of combine two questions that were asked. So Abdullah, who led the High Council for National Reconciliation, seems to be quite an interesting character and political survivor. Also, with the recent history of US negotiations and compromise with Baradar, there is something there with him as well, one of the co-founders of the Taliban. So do you see either playing a role in the future government moving forward?
Yes, so the Hamid Karzai, Abdullah, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar are the three figures that reportedly may play some role in a combined government, and that would be extremely interesting to follow and watch. And Abdullah, questioner is right. He's been the leading politician of the Tajik and Jamiat Islami, the party that represents, I would say, one of the strongest non-Pashtun factions. Pashtuns are the majority population of Afghanistan. He was the vice president and the head of the negotiating team for the Afghan government. I've known him for years, and he's not just a survivor. I mean, I think he's probably the kind of individual, along with Karzai, that will really try to figure out now that it's the Afghans, it's up to the Afghans, I think, to really make this happen. What are the kinds of deals they will accept, and what can they get in return for it? And Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was actually the one faction of the Taliban that came in from the cold. So that's actually a faction that gave up arms, came into government, took positions in parliament. So I think for those that really have interest in seeing how Afghanistan begins to work this out, those three, and they're all out there on Twitter, so you can follow them and use the translate function to actually follow this drama that I think will be central to determining how brutal or not this regime becomes.
Thank you. One of our audience members also asked, of what nationality are the Taliban? What portion of them are Afghani?
Oh, they're Afghans and they're Pashtun. So again, that's the majority population. And then you get very down in the weeds in terms of the different Pashtun tribes and what part of the country, and that the eastern Pashtun have historic rivalries with the Kandahar-based southern Pashtun. So you can get into endless kind of salami slicing. Hamid Karzai, for example, the former president, is a Pashtun from southern Afghanistan. So I think it's very interesting to see how they're already quickly coming around to presumably some types of discussions. The Taliban, as I've mentioned, there were early offers after the US came in following 9/11 to negotiate. Baradar was the other figure mentioned in the questioner's comments. He is the leader. We actually captured him in a joint operation with Pakistan, but people that knew the architecture of that movement said he is the guy, if you're really serious about negotiations, that you're going to need to negotiate with. So there was an arrangement made eventually for him to be released from jail in Pakistan and to lead the talks there in Qatar. And I think, the idea, and my view is, if we had really prioritized this early on, an international mediated agreement might have been reached, but it really wasn't the main effort. And as I heard my colleague and the esteemed Ambassador Jim Dobbins, who was one of the architects of the agreement in Bonn that really set up the post 9/11 government, he said, we never considered negotiating with the Taliban because, of course, the Taliban had given haven to Al Qaeda, which attacked the US. But in retrospect, many wars do end with negotiations. And I think it is and historians will really want to take a look at this. Were there key junctures where we could have reached a negotiated solution? And my view was, in the surge of 2011-12, that was our peak leverage, and we should have pressed for that then.
Ooh, our audience is good, aren't they? All right, let's keep going. So it seems that there's quite a bit of disagreement between the upper level of the Taliban command and the Taliban fighters on the ground. Do you expect that there will be some infighting in the Taliban itself?
Yes, so this is another great question. I am really enjoying this because there is always a question for leaders, especially those outside the country. Are they really in control of troops on the ground, or do the leaders in country have a different view and more autonomy? And I think it's actually a bit more of a coherent movement than people may realize. It's been quite organized for many years. What I think is that they were not prepared to govern this quickly. And in fact, there was a statement today from, I think it was the Taliban spokesman, saying, one reason we're asking women to stay indoors right now in Kabul and other places is because our foot soldiers are not trained on how to treat women. So you have these rural fighters, these basically thugs with guns coming into the city and treating women in a brutal way, taking cars, doing searches. Now, there has been more control of them, frankly, than might have been. But it was an interesting admission that they have a tactical problem in that their directives aren't necessarily being implemented at the groundmost level. So I think that's another thing to watch very closely in these next days. Really, in a matter of days and weeks, we'll see, do they have enough command and control over those foot soldiers on the ground? Most of them have changed into US uniforms because they've seized all kinds of weapons, material, vehicles. So they're parading around in US supplied uniforms with US supplied guns and US vehicles. And so they look at first glance like they might be US trained forces until you see, the big beard and so forth. They are, I think the big question is, are the rank and file on the ground going to run rampant, or will you see more control being asserted quickly?
Another question from our audience. I understand that many Afghan army soldiers were actually Taliban being trained by the US to use their equipment. They, of course, gave up when the time was right. I have heard estimates of over 30 to 40% of the army. How did we not know this?
So the insider threat issue has been with us for a while. I recounted a couple of incidents in my book, and the so-called green on blue, green being our partner force, the Afghans, hitting our force blue. But I don't know that I would not be able to endorse those figures as far as the proportion. And Taliban, card carrying Taliban, or perhaps soldiers that felt offended by the dominant presence of the US and the NATO forces. I remember way back many, many years ago, there were part of the coalition included Polish forces, and Polish forces had the major role of training and peacekeeping operations in Wardak province. And there, the Afghans were saying they're Russians because they heard their accent. They thought they were speaking Russian. It's a very nationalistic country. So I think there are many reasons why that phenomenon existed. And it's not new. So again, we have, I think right now, many accusations of intelligence failures. And I think that I would just, if you don't mind, I would just say, I think that we have a political climate or culture now in our country where we immediately want to assume the worst and attack one another verbally. And I think that while we need a thorough assessment of what was done right and what was done wrong, I think that there's a little bit more nuance warranted, since I think the majority of Americans did feel the commitment we made for 20 years was a long commitment. People say, oh, we've stayed in Japan, South Korea, Germany. But I think that you really have to take a close look at that analogy and consider that Afghanistan, while important, was certainly a locus of the origin of the 9/11 attacks. It's not a top tier interest of the US. And I think that we have to be willing to step back. Maybe not at this moment, maybe people's passions are too hot, but I think we need to understand that having a major commitment to that country, there's an opportunity cost in terms of what we could and perhaps should be doing elsewhere.
Now that we are committed to leaving, what do you see as the opportunity created for players such as China and Russia? Specifically, how do you see the relationship play out in the pursuit of rule of law, especially with Chinese or Taliban characteristics, and in the pursuit of PR or mass media in creating information propaganda, and in the pursuit of leaving corruption for gain of strategic advantage? So, rule of law, PR, mass media, and leveraging corruption playing out.
So we never conquered the corruption in Afghanistan. And in fact, that's one of my critiques, that by pouring so much money in ways, there was actually a fund that U.S. Agency for International Development paid a 5-figure monthly stipend to provincial governors. That would be called corruption by some people's definition, but it was simply a way to try to give them the ability to do things. But it was a blank check, if you will. There are other far more egregious examples. I think this is a fascinating question, though, that in fact, now where we are headed, Russia's interests, China's interests, Pakistan's interests, and Iran's interests are really going to be driving forces of what comes next. And Russia, of course, is very concerned that there not be terrorist fighters and groups going to feed the precarious state of Central Asian states, its southern perimeter. China is very concerned about feeding things like the Uyghur movement in Xinjiang province. So these countries are going to be looking at security and stability in the first instance. China has major contracts like the INEC mine, railroad concessions, things they are very interested in profiting from the development of Afghanistan, which has great mineral resources that China would like. But what are they willing to do to stabilize the country, support the people? Stability can come in many forms, and I think it will be interesting to see if they are willing to promote some forms of development. China's policy has generally been to bring in its own labor force, so that even may not become a source of employment for Afghans, unfortunately. I don't think that one can be terribly sanguine about them being a force for development of a democratic civil society. And Russia, of course, has been very opposed to regime change anywhere in the world, witness its strong support of the Assad regime in Syria. So I don't think any of these things are going to progress because of those neighboring countries.
We've known Biden's timeline for a while. It's frustrating. There are so many US citizens there knowing what was coming. Unfortunately, those citizens and LPRs are taking up space that could have been used for eligible Afghans. Even though the country has been at war, LPRs and citizens freely went back and forth without much concern for their safety. There's not really a question here, but I would be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I guess I would like to say I don't think it should be an either or question. And it goes back to, I think, the really legitimate criticism right now is a failure to plan and initiate in a more timely fashion a robust exit strategy that included getting out all the people, not just our citizens and LPRs, but those that had worked with us, and not just for the US or coalition military, but also many other entities, including, US news organizations. No one can really work there without the aid of an Afghan local employee. So there are all kinds of people that were tied to us that can be legitimately considered at risk. And then, of course, women who are, I think, particularly at risk. And I mentioned the Hazara population as well. So it's really going to require, I think, a robust and well executed policy that has humane consideration for all of these categories of people.
Iran is no friend of the Taliban. Does this present a new opportunity for the US or the West to new avenues of cooperation with Iran, perhaps fighting heroin flows from Afghanistan through Iran to Europe?
Well, as the director of our Middle East Center, of course, I look over the entire Middle East, and the Biden administration has front and center the desire to renew the nuclear agreement to restrain Iran's development of nuclear weapon and broaden and deepen it. That's not going terribly well at the moment. There's a new hardline government in consolidation of Iran's hardline government with the advent of a new president who's very much in lockstep with the supreme leader and presided over the deaths and executions of thousands of people. So right now, I think the question is really what's in Iran's interest and what is Iran likely to do? And because it was seeing the creeping takeover of the Taliban in the country over these years, they initiated tactical contacts with the Taliban, and they want to deter massive immigration, refugee floods into their country. So I think, again, it's a question of whether their interests and their leverage can produce some beneficial outcomes there. They, of course, do not want the extremist Taliban or extremist groups coming into their country, even though they've also had tactical arrangements over the years with al-Qaeda figures. So Iran is very adept at playing a complicated game. And I think it could be that the US, if it can reach an agreement on the nuclear file with Iran, that may, and that thus ease some of the sanctions on Iran, that may lead in time to the ability to cooperate on other fronts, including this one.
So we do only have about 4 minutes left, but hopefully I can get in these last two questions because I think they're pretty good. So what sources of information would you recommend for those of us wishing to follow this situation closely?
Well, I always believe in a wide variety of news sources. And if you're interested in a news source within Afghanistan, and I think it's another very important bellwether of where the Taliban is going to go, Tolo News is an operation that was founded by Saad Mohseni, who is an Afghan Australian, and he built really a major media empire, if you will, there. They had their America's Got Talent version, and a woman won their singing competition in 2019. He has female anchors who have already been on the air. They came out right away and interviewed some of the Taliban leaders. So they're trying to make a stand and push, that this society is modernized, the urban Afghanistan at least, and they want to hold on to some of those positions and rights that they've achieved. I would encourage that. The BBC, I think, is because they have such a vast network of reporters, deep and long interest in South Asia. I would say don't just consume US sources, although we have excellent US sources, and I personally find, PBS and NPR to be good, balanced ones, but people should just find an array of sources. I think the problem can often occur if you're simply consuming one diet. The other thing is I get a lot of instant news from Twitter, but I try to follow people that I know are either on the ground or have some position of expertise that I can trust, that I know they have the credentials. It's just, I think, very important for people to evaluate the sources of their information. And I think, Michelle, you wanted to get in one more question, so I apologize for that long answer, but it's a good question that's dear to my heart as a former journalist.
No, you're good. I'm gonna stick this question in anyway. We never had a clear goal for the war in Afghanistan, nor the war in Iraq either, just a fuzzy notion of democracy. James Baldwin said, freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take, and people are as free as they want to be. How does America learn the lesson of Afghanistan and Iraq and hopefully not do this again? I just thought this was a really nice way to think about
Yes.
the future. So,
Again, these are all wonderful questions. And I think, there was obviously a desire to find and get bin Laden. But I think the way the strategy did evolve was an idea that we needed an enduring defeat of these groups. And to do that, you needed to build a security capability in those countries that was capable of standing on its own. And my real main broad point here is we have to make sure we're adopting the right model. And I think we did not in Afghanistan. In Iraq, we've actually made much more progress there, and they have the resources and the human capital to take it forward. And we have conditions where we could have a small security footprint there to good effect. Unfortunately, Afghanistan, much, much tougher case. And I think we have to be somewhat humbled by these experiences and say, how much can we do? And when do we say a modest gain is better than overreach? And I think that's kind of where many of us are at this point.
well, thank you, Linda. I think we've kept you on your toes. What a great audience. And I thought some great questions, really great answers too. I feel like there's a lot of depth in there. This is going to be recorded. So if you wanted to watch it again, you can at a later date. And I just want to say thank you, Linda, again, for jumping on this opportunity to talk to our community. There was a lot of questions. There are still a lot of questions actually in our Q&A that we didn't get to also. So this topic obviously is, on the front of everyone's mind. So I just